The pillow still held the shape of his head, like even fabric couldn't forget. Light from the window fell in the same place, but I wasn't the same woman standing in it. He didn't say goodbye. I didn't ask him to. That bed wasn't sacred anymore. And I didn't lose something, I recovered it. The knock wasn't loud. Just enough to interrupt the kind of silence that doesn't belong to noise but to time. I didn't move at first. I thought it might be the wind nudging the shutters again, the way it often did in early autumn, but then it came again. One knock. Then stillness. I opened the door halfway. He stood there soaked through. Rain clung to his collar and pooled at the base of his boots. He didn't speak right away. Didn't need to. Julian. I hadn't said that name out loud in years. He was older now, of course, but some things still held. The slight tilt of his head when he waited, the way he never filled a room with noise. Engine gave out. Up on the ridge, he said, as if explaining the weather. I remembered this house. There were a dozen ways I could have said no. A dozen reasons to keep the door half closed. But I stepped back. Quietly. Like a reflex I hadn't used in a long time. He walked in with a kind of familiarity that unsettled me. Not in how he looked around, but how his presence rearranged the air itself. Like memory arriving before context. He took off his jacket and laid it carefully over the chair near the fire that hadn't been lit in days. A trace of steam lifted off the shoulders. The room warmed slightly, but not from the hearth. I busied myself with the kettle. Water. Flame. A second mug placed beside the first. Not out of habit. Not out of politeness. Something in between. He glanced toward the wall where the mantel clock still ticked. A gift from his father. A reminder I had meant to forget. Still works, he murmured. I didn't answer. The rain softened outside. Just enough to let the wind through the cracks in the wood. He watched me. Not with intensity. With recognition. I poured tea. The chamomile rose in slow spirals of steam. He reached for his mug, and my hand brushed the rim a beat before his. No contact. But not distance either. You live here alone now? His voice was low. Careful. Like he wasn't asking for the answer, just the admission. Yes, I said, though the word felt inadequate. Alone sounded like something unfinished. I took my seat across from him. Not opposite. Just near enough that our knees almost touched beneath the table's wooden edge. Almost. He looked older than I remembered, but not in years, in thought. Like someone who had held too many silences and finally brought one back to share. I didn't ask why he was really here. And he didn't pretend there was only one reason. I stirred honey into my cup. He didn't. He never had. Some habits, apparently, were made in the bones. When he looked at me, it wasn't with question or expectation. It was with a kind of steadiness that unsettled me more than longing would have. I looked back. Just long enough. And when I did, something in the air tilted. Slightly. But I felt it. That night I didn't close the curtains. I think I wanted the sea to witness what I hadn't dared to name. He came back 2 days later. Didn't call. Didn't ask. Just knocked once, and when I opened the door he said nothing. Only held up a loaf of sourdough wrapped in brown paper, like an offering to a silence we'd both agreed to keep. I let him in. Again. And so it began. The return that never came with explanation. One visit folded into another. Each time the same but never quite. Same jacket hung on the same chair. Same mug placed at the same angle. Same steam rising, but the air thickened. We never talked about the first evening. It stretched behind us like a room we'd locked but hadn't left. He started staying longer. We sat in the same places, moved through the house with a rhythm that felt rehearsed. At one point he reached for the bookshelf. His fingertips lingered on a spine I hadn't touched in years. You've read this. I used to, I said, and watched his hand. Not the book. Not his eyes. Just the way his thumb moved, slow, deliberate, across worn leather. He asked about the music I played the way one asks not to learn but to remember. What was that piece yesterday? Chopin, I said. Nocturne in E minor. He didn't reply. Just nodded. But the next time he came I heard it, already playing before I opened the door. The weather stayed gray that week. Rain like a background hum. We walked in the garden one afternoon, boots silent in the wet grass. The space between us was narrowing, not in motion, in weight. His sleeve brushed mine when we passed the rosemary hedge. Neither of us paused. Neither of us apologized. But I carried that moment in my mouth for hours, like something hot I couldn't swallow. The kitchen became a place of choreography. He'd hand me the honey. I'd pass him the spoon. Sometimes our fingers aligned too long. Sometimes they didn't. "Do you ever get visitors?" he asked once, stirring his tea. "Not really." I paused. "There's no one to expect." "You're not seeing anyone?" I looked at the window where rain streaked down the glass like old handwriting. "There's no one else here, Julian. There hasn't been for a long time." He didn't press. I didn't offer. But when I turned around, he was already watching me, with that same expression from the first night. The one that didn't ask for anything but said too much. And in that quiet, something tightened, like the breath between inhale and confession. There was no touch, no claim, but the room had shifted, and I wasn't sure anymore who had moved it. I told myself that if he stopped coming, I'd find relief in the return of quiet. But when 3 days passed and he didn't knock, I realized I hadn't been breathing at all. He came late that night. Later than usual. Later than anyone polite would. But somehow it felt like the right hour for things that don't ask permission. He had a bottle of red in one hand and the chill of October clinging to his coat. I didn't ask where he'd been. I didn't ask why now. I just opened the door and stepped aside. Again. The fireplace hadn't been lit in weeks. I struck a match with more intention than I meant to, the flame flickering like it was thinking twice. He stood behind me as I crouched. I didn't turn, but I could feel the pause in his breath, that subtle give in the room when something unspoken starts pressing against the walls. "Your lights were off," he said. I wasn't sure if. I stayed facing the fire. "They're always off this time of night," I said. "Doesn't mean I'm sleeping." He sat down after I did. Not close. Not far. Just enough for the warmth to blur between us. The Chopin started on its own. I'd forgotten it was set on repeat. Or maybe I hadn't. We sipped slowly, not from thirst. I tasted the wine but couldn't name it. I watched the way the glass caught the firelight more than I watched him. "My father never talked about you," he said, fingers curled around the stem. "He talked enough," I said. "Just not about the things that mattered." He didn't flinch. Just nodded like he'd suspected as much. "But I wondered," he said, "what kind of woman could undo a man without raising her voice?" I laughed quietly. "You give me too much credit. I didn't undo him." He was already unraveling. There was a silence then, not heavy, not awkward. Just slow, like breath taken in halfway and held too long. He stood to leave. I followed. When he reached for his coat, his hand hesitated, then settled lightly on my shoulder. Not possessive, not fleeting, just still. I turned. Slowly. The air between us thinned. His eyes didn't ask. Mine didn't answer. There was no movement, no rush. Just the echo of the same piano note stretching out as if time had caught its breath and didn't know where to place it. Our faces were close enough to feel what wasn't said. His breath brushed mine, not urgent, just warm, certain. I didn't look away. "Stay," I said, and then softer. "But don't try to name this yet." Later I couldn't recall what happened first. His hand, my breath, the shifting light. Only that the boundaries blurred, not from intention but from recognition. Like music melting through wood. We didn't speak again that night. And I didn't sleep. But I also didn't feel tired. When I came into the kitchen at dawn, the cup he used was rinsed but not dried. Left upside down on the rack as if to say, "I was here but I didn't stay." Or maybe, "I stayed but not in the way you'll admit aloud." That morning the house smelled like cedar, old wine and memory. I opened the window. The sea didn't look away. I waited 2 days before noticing I was waiting. Not actively. Not with longing. Just, with less stillness than usual. I kept walking the same stretch of beach each morning, like the tide might carry back something that had slipped quietly out of reach. The mornings were colder now. I wore a scarf I didn't remember owning until I realized it wasn't mine. His. Wool. Dark gray. Folded over the back of the kitchen chair, like a memory too soft to discard. I washed it anyway. Folded it again. Placed it inside the drawer where I keep gloves I no longer wear. I didn't call. I didn't text. And when I looked at my phone, I told myself it was for the weather. The record player stayed off that week. But one evening I lifted the lid anyway. Stared at the needle. Let it drop. The Chopin started again, soft, familiar, intrusive. I turned it off after 6 bars. Each morning I boiled water for 2 cups. Set them out. One left untouched. The other lukewarm by the time I finished it. Then I poured them both down the sink. Twice I caught myself hesitating. Fingers around the porcelain rim like they remembered a different weight. The house didn't feel emptier. Just more honest. Like it had stopped pretending the silence was decorative. There was no note. No explanation. Only absence in its purest form, without cruelty, without closure. I thought about the way he looked at me that night. Not as someone seeking permission, but as someone who had already made peace with the question. I told myself I was fine. And mostly I was. But there were slivers in the day that didn't land right. The way the chair scraped the floor when I sat down alone. The way the hallway held onto his scent longer than it should have. One morning, I opened the door to water the plants, and saw the white blossoms blooming just below the windowsill. I don't remember planting them, but there they were. Small, soft, insistent. I stood there longer than needed, not because I didn't know what to do, but because I wasn't sure for whom I was doing it. That afternoon I cleaned the kitchen shelves, rearranged the tea tins, found his mug still inverted from the week before. I picked it up, turned it upright, left it there, and still I didn't call. Still he didn't come. But each time I opened the curtain in the front room, my eyes traced the same line of trees across the ridge, where the road curves out of sight. I wasn't sad. But every time I opened the window, I found myself looking toward the hill. Not for someone to return, but for the shape of a moment I wasn't done remembering. I didn't hear the sound of his car. Just the hush of tires on damp gravel, and then a shadow passing the window, familiar but not expected. Julian knocked once, then stepped in like the air inside this house had been holding its breath for him. He didn't apologize, didn't explain, just sat down at the same spot he had before, as though no time had passed, as though nothing had bent the space between us. The fire in the hearth had not caught yet, but his presence already warmed the room, and unsettled it in equal measure. I ladled soup into 2 bowls. The steam rose between us like a veil we weren't ready to lift. We ate in silence. Not tense, not comfortable. Just suspended. Like 2 people waiting for a line of music to return after too long a rest. Then he said quietly, "My father once told me you were the only woman he couldn't fully reach." I didn't answer right away. Didn't look up. Just let the heat of the bowl seep into my palms. "Perhaps because I was already reached," I said at last, "before he ever came." The words didn't fall like betrayal. They didn't even echo. They settled between us like something both known and finally said aloud. He didn't flinch. Didn't look away. His stillness wasn't withdrawal. It was understanding. He rose and walked around the room, taking it in. The books, the low light, the scent of thyme and wood. Then his eyes paused on the far wall. The photograph of my father. "It's gone." I nodded slowly. "I no longer keep things that don't belong to me." That too stayed unanswered. Not because he disagreed, but because it didn't require reply. He turned back, stepped closer to the table, his hand brushing the chair, not quite reaching for the scarf folded over it. The same one he had left unknowingly a week ago. I had meant to return it. I hadn't. For a moment I thought he'd sit again. But he didn't. He looked at me, truly looked. Not with desire. Not even apology. Just clarity. Like someone finally calling a thing by its name, after years of pretending it was something else. He said my name, only my name. No Mrs., no polite frame. Just the word, raw and weightless and bare. Sounded like a beginning but felt like a reckoning. I didn't ask him to stay. And he didn't ask what this meant. But in that silence we both knew. The question had already been answered long before he arrived tonight. He didn't ask me anything. But that look, like the first time he spoke my name without title. As if there had never been a third person between us. That night I didn't lie beside him. I played instead. Chopin again, fingers slow over ivory, as if retracing steps across a floor I'd once fled from. The notes wavered not from hesitation, but from something thinner, closer to breath. I knew he was awake. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from sleep but from restraint. The fireplace had long gone out. The scent of ash lingered with the scent of old linen and something else, something left unspoken in the space between our chairs. I didn't look his way. He didn't rise to stop me. Moonlight poured in through the side window. It didn't warm the room but it marked it. The keys gleamed where my hands moved, slow and bare. For a moment it felt like I was playing not for him, not even for me, but for the version of myself that had been quiet too long. I didn't say good night. Just stood. The chair creaked as I left, not from weight but from memory. His breath followed me down the hall. There was no sound but I felt it. And when I closed my door, it was with the softness of someone who had nothing to hide, but something to hold back. By morning the sky had softened into a pale blue. Dew clung to the leaves like something waiting to fall, but choosing not to. I stepped outside barefoot, in a dress I hadn't worn since the year before he was born. It no longer fit the same but it fit the choice I had made. He found the letter on the table. I hadn't folded it neatly. Just once, like a pause in a sentence too difficult to finish. I do not need to be chosen again. I only need to know I still can choose. If you return, bring with you something other than regret. I imagined his hands hovering above the page before touching it. I imagined his eyes stopping not at the words but between them. When he came to the door I didn't turn. The garden was still damp underfoot. A white bloom had opened sometime in the night, beneath the windowsill, half hidden by mint. I hadn't planted it. Or perhaps I had and forgotten. His footsteps paused on the threshold. He didn't speak. I didn't invite. There was no need. Then he stepped out. And for the first time I didn't flinch. I didn't brace for explanation or apology, or even a lie told gently. I stood and let the moment breathe. He passed me. I heard the gravel give way beneath him. But just before the road curved beyond the hill, he turned. I didn't move. Neither did he. But in that quiet, his gaze did what words never could. It didn't ask. It didn't offer. It acknowledged. And I knew. I was no longer a woman waiting to be remembered. I was someone who had remembered herself completely, finally, without fear. He left without a sound. And I remained, beneath a sky that no longer asked who I was. I no longer lived to be remembered. I lived to not forget who I am. I never waited for anyone after that. I used to say I was just being patient. But no, what I was afraid of choosing. Afraid that if I reached out first it meant I needed something. And needing had always felt like weakness, hadn't it? But that morning, white dress, dew on the cuffs, breath still chilled from the night before. I stood alone in the garden and didn't feel small. I didn't need him to stay. I didn't need to be the woman someone remembered. I needed to remember myself. And I did. Even if no one ever looked back again. I had turned toward myself. And that was enough. There was a time when I thought silence was dignity. When I believed the woman who smiled and said little would be loved more. I spent years folding my wants into napkins, swallowing the heat in my chest like it was something shameful. I used to write letters I never sent. And I used to cry into my own sleeve thinking no one noticed. Maybe that's what growing up as a woman meant in those years, learning how to disappear in plain sight. But here's what I've come to believe now, after everything. It isn't desire that makes us foolish. It's pretending we don't have any. Desire, when owned, not begged for, can be the stillest kind of strength. And freedom doesn't come from being untouched. It comes from no longer apologizing for having been moved. If any part of this made you pause, if there was a line in this story that sat with you longer than it should have, like the scent of something faintly familiar, you're not alone. Maybe you've had your own white dress moment. Maybe you've stood in a garden, watched someone walk away and didn't call out, because somehow standing was more powerful than pleading. If that's true, leave a like. Not for me, but for yourself. For that version of you who stayed silent once, too long maybe, and is just now learning the sound of their own voice. And if this story moves something in you, even a little, maybe share it. Quiet stories deserve to be heard too. We tell these things not to stir the heart into longing, but to remind it. Permission was always yours to give. I never asked him why he turned back, just that once. He didn't wave. I didn't smile. But something passed between us, slow, invisible, final, and perhaps enough. I no longer live to be remembered. I live to not forget who I am.